All right. So having said the limitations to maximal endurance performance are going to be your VO2 max and your power velocity or speed at lactate threshold, or what percentage of your VO2 max you can compete at. Now we need to go back and we need to talk about these things and how we can modify them, how we can adapt, how our training is going to change VO2 max. How is our training going to change power velocity at lactate threshold? And that's really going to be the focus of the next 6 lectures, is how are we adapting through our training to increase these measures that are going to be at the limits of our performance. All right, so the first one we're going to talk about is VO2 max. And VO2 max, again, is the maximum volume of oxygen that you can use to produce energy aerobically. All right, so what is VO2 max? It's basically what you would normally see is as you increase speed, your oxygen intake would increase in a linear fashion. And this is the study that I gave you for this, which is the reason I gave it to you is because A.V. Hill is one of the greatest physiologists of all time, won a Nobel Prize. He was an incredible physiologist. He was also an incredible athlete, as you can see by the fact that he was able to run a 5:39 mile pace, because all of these big open circles, that's all of his data. So this is back in the day when you used to do a study, and you used to be, if you're an author on the study, you're also going to be a subject in the study. So all of these dots are actually the subjects in the study. Many of them weren't able to run fast enough to get up into the higher range here, but A.V. Hill was able to do this. 5:39 pace at about 47 years old, according to about this time. That's what he would have been. Right, and he was running on a grass track, and he was in Oxford, and they had like this big, huge bag called a Douglas bag hanging out of his mouth. So it's not a light feat to be able to do that. So part of the paper was him bragging, but the rest of it was actually he identified every single aspect of the limits to endurance performance in this series of papers, and really what he looked at here was this idea of VO2 max. He also has a section on it in movement economy. But what you can see is as you increase speed, up into a point, you increase oxygen uptake, because that oxygen you take in is being delivered to your muscles that are working, and those muscles are producing energy, which your body can use to have you go that speed. Now, the problem is that as you go faster and faster and faster, you're going to get to a point where you can keep getting faster, but no matter how much faster you get, you're not able to use any more oxygen. You're not able to take any more oxygen in and use it to produce energy aerobically. And what that means is that you can't actually continue to run at these speeds for very long, because what you're doing is you're using other forms of energy to run when you go at, for him, 5:39. Because you can see that he stopped increasing his oxygen intake after about 4 meters per second. But he's still able to get up to about 4.75 meters per second. That's a lot faster, but he's not able to maintain that because you can't produce energy aerobically. That means that the only energy you're getting is from non-aerobic sources. That means it's from glycolytic sources. And that means that those glycolytic sources are very limited in how big they are. All right, so now what you get is you get these individuals who they're increasing their exercise intensity, but you're not increasing oxygen uptake. If you were to do this using CO2 to O2, what you're looking for is a ratio of an RER of 1.1 or above is a cutoff to say you're at VO2 max. Okay, so really what this is telling us that no matter how much faster we go, we're not going to take in any more oxygen because we can't possibly deliver and use that oxygen. All right, so what determines VO2 max? So there's really 3 things. There's stroke volume, there's heart rate, and there's the AVO2 difference. That's the arterial venous difference. So if you measured oxygen on the arterial side of your muscle and the venous side of your muscle, what you would see is how much oxygen that muscle has taken out. So if we measure oxygen leaving the heart and oxygen coming back into the heart using the aorta on one side and the vena cava on the other to say how much oxygen have we used, that's going to give us our whole body, and that's going to give us our AVO2 difference. So presumably at that point you're going to see much lower, but if you were to say running, and what you're looking at is the legs, you could go through the femoral artery and the femoral vein. that would give you how much oxygen your muscles were able to take up. And this other side is telling us how much oxygen or how much blood you were able to provide or supply to the working muscle. Okay, so VO2 max equals stroke volume times heart rate multiplied by your maximum AVO2 difference. Okay, so stroke volume times heart rate, that's cardiac output. Everybody should be able to see that. And that means that since cardiac output is a key factor in VO2 max, that means that you should see a proportional increase. When we increase cardiac output, we should increase VO2 max. And that was done first by Per-Olof Åstrand, a very famous Swedish scientist who wrote the first exercise physiology book. And what you can see is here he measured cardiac output and then he measured maximum oxygen uptake or VO2 max. And what you can see is there's a beautiful correlation between your maximum cardiac output and your VO2 max. All right. And another thing that you can see here is that VO2 max and cardiac output are both trainable. So they're trainable because at this time, even in Sweden in 1964, women were still not encouraged to exercise, to do endurance exercise. So because they didn't train very much, they had lower cardiac output, and as a result, they had lower VO2 max. The men were encouraged to exercise more, do more endurance exercise, and as a result, they had bigger cardiac outputs. If we redid this study today, first of all, the men would have lower cardiac outputs than VO2 maxes because on average, we're getting less and less fit over time. And in the last 60 years, since 1960s, we've gotten significantly lower in our fitness. So cardiac output would be down, VO2 max would be down, and then what you would see is the women would overlap with the men completely. There's not a gender or sex-based difference here that is existing other than the fact that at this time women weren't encouraged to exercise, and as a result they weren't trained. So how are we controlling cardiac output? Our control of cardiac output, as we increase exercise intensity, we're going to increase heart rate in a linear fashion, and our stroke volume, so how big our heart gets, is going to increase linearly at the beginning. Then it's going to plateau and it's going to reach its maximum at 40% of VO2 max. So everything over 40% of VO2 max, the increase in cardiac output you have between 40 and 100% of VO2 max is all the result of heart rate, increases in heart rate. That's why in those older athletes we talked about before, they saw that they had a decrease in VO2 max because their maximum heart rate was lower. Because 220 minus your age is a good estimate for your maximum heart rate. I'm 30-ish years older than you guys, so you guys should have about 30 beats per minute higher maximum heart rate than I do. So if you and I are going to have the same cardiac output or the same VO2 max, how are we going to do that? How am I going to do something to adapt that is going to allow me to compensate for the fact that I have a lower heart rate? Of course, it's to increase my stroke volume. So my heart has to get bigger. I need to be able to pump more blood with every pump, because cardiac output is the volume of blood that you can pump in a minute. That's going to be the volume that you pump in each stroke of your heart times the number of times your heart beats per minute. And so those two things are going to correlate really well with your VO2 max. All right? But it also tells us that the maximum stretch on the heart happens at as low as 40% of your maximum VO2. So what that tells us is that we are, if the stimulus for our heart to get bigger and stronger is the stretch on the heart, then all you have to do is exercise at 40% of VO2 max in order to get a maximal stretch on the heart. Why is it important that we have a high cardiac output? Because if we have a high cardiac output, we can deliver more blood. In the blood, we're going to be delivering oxygen. And really, that's what the key for blood flow is going to be, is oxygen delivery. So the reason that our heart is so important in VO2 max is because that pumping action, the delivery of oxygen or delivery of blood is going to carry oxygen. And this is a study that was, again, only could have been done in Sweden, because basically they took people, they had them breathe in normal air. They then increased the oxygen content of the air in the red symbols. And in the open symbols, what they had them do is they had them inhale carbon monoxide. And again, carbon monoxide binds irreversibly to hemoglobin. And when it does that, oxygen can't bind to hemoglobin, so your oxygen carrying capacity goes down. So what they then did is they looked at each individual when they inhaled carbon monoxide, normal air or high oxygen air. And what you can see is there's this relationship where the more oxygen you can transport, the higher your VO2 max is. Okay? And so this is, again, it's crazy because carbon monoxide is what kills you in a fire. But here, instead of taking them to the hospital when they'd inhaled carbon monoxide, they're going to put them onto a bike and make them exercise as hard as they can. Right? But what this experiment showed us really conclusively was that if we increase oxygen in the air, we increase our oxygen delivery, we can increase our VO2 max. So the real correlation here is oxygen delivery is the key, and that's what the heart is doing. By pumping really big volumes of blood, it's delivering really big volumes of oxygen. So is it really all about the heart? Is it predominantly about the heart? This is a great experiment that shows that it is all about the heart. So what this is they took pigs and they removed the pericardium. And what they did is they did the pericardium, they exercised them before they did the surgery to remove the pericardium. And then they let them adapt, they surgically removed the pericardium and they exercised them again. And what they found is that with the pericardium on, their cardiac output was 22 liters per minute, and their VO2 max was 48 milliliters per kilogram per body weight. Now what happens as you take the pericardium off is now there's not so what the pericardium is, it's like the tendon that surrounds the heart, and it protects the heart by limiting how big it can get. So if you take it off, now the heart can get bigger. And you see the stroke volume went up 20 milliliters. That's a huge increase in stroke volume. So what happens? Cardiac output goes up 30%. And when you increase cardiac output 30%, already VO2 max goes up by 30%. So there's a direct relationship to the increase in stroke volume, increase in cardiac output, and the increase in VO2 max. And so what that's telling us is that the bigger our heart is, the more volume of oxygen it can deliver, the higher our VO2 max is going to be.